Hugo, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much, Sam.
It's been 15 months now since the US President Donald Trump raised $50 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods. China retaliated, adding tariffs of its own. Now there are tariffs on a total of $500 billion worth of goods combined. When it all began in April last year, what were the president's key demands and what did he hope to achieve?
So all these developments are very concerning. When President Trump began his term in January 2017, he was elected off the back of a campaign railing against trade and what he perceived as unfair trade deals with many emerging and major economies around the world, including China. He looked to trade deficits where American consumers were importing more than American producers were exporting, saw an imbalance there and wanted to rectify that. That was, for the president, his main concern were the trade deficits, and China was his number one target.
So in the lead up to recent trade talks in Washington, several former world leaders, including former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, wrote an open letter which was published in the New York Times, calling on the US and China to resolve their differences. The letter likened the current trade war to the beginning of the Cold War, with some countries being forced to choose sides. Is this a reasonable statement or is that over the top?
So we've known for a very long time that the rise of China would result in US's dominance in the world, predominance in the world being balanced out with another great power. Now, with respect to the Cold War analogies, the last time there were two great powers operating side by side with different values, interests and systems, there was a Cold War. So in some ways that analysis and the anxieties around how this relationship will play out holds water. Whether there's a current Cold War happening right now, the current tensions are very concerning, and some people are terming the current environment as a Cold War with economic characteristics.
Sure, even Chinese diplomats have called on Australia to end what it calls a Cold War mentality. Is the trade war responsible for creating this sense of Australia having to choose between the US and China, or has it always been difficult for Australia to simultaneously manage relations with the two superpowers?
Sure. Well, Australia is not the only country in the world with a major defence and security and economic and investment relationship with America, and not the only country to also have a major economic and also a security relationship with China. So Australia, among with many countries in the world, has to manage these issues. When the two great powers are struggling to manage these issues themselves, that creates challenges for Australian diplomacy and for diplomats all around the world.
So how is this tension being felt by other countries in the region?
Well, the US and China, as with other major emerging powers in the world, are all in what we call the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, our part of the world, Australia's backyard, where the US, China, India, Indonesia all operate. Now, every week there's a major public forum or conference in which world leaders in our part of the world are expressing their concern around recent developments and are urging the US and China to resolve their differences in an orderly and peaceful manner.
One of those forums was the recent International Monetary Fund talks last week, when they downgraded the global growth forecast for 2019 to 3%, and this is the lowest since 2008-2009. What are the risks to the global economy if the trade war is not resolved?
So yeah, of course the IMF globally and indeed the Reserve Bank here have downgraded growth forecasts. The trade war is seriously impacting on investor certainty. It's resulting in reduced trade volumes, and that is having an impact amongst other factors in sluggish economic growth. And in the long term, that causes challenges for domestic economies like Australia and the international economic system.
And how has the trade war been felt here in Australia? How has it impacted Australia?
Well, in Western Australia, where half of our exports go to China, the first consideration is always the economic impacts. In some ways, Australia is fortunate that its major economic relationship with China is in iron ore, which is a result of China's domestic construction and manufacturing, and often in times of sluggish economic growth, the Chinese will stimulate their domestic economy and stimulate their domestic builds, which is of benefit to Australia. So whilst there's a lack of certainty in the economic climate right now, Australia in some ways benefits in certain instances from the trade war due to Chinese domestic stimulus.
That's interesting that you say that China ups its own domestic stimulus to try and combat this economic downturn and that Australia may benefit. Are there any other countries that may be benefiting from the trade war?
So in the long term, no country wins from a trade war. But what we are seeing is a relocation of certain companies and investments into other markets to get around the tariffs or to generally occupy emerging market jurisdictions which are growing of their own accord, such as in Vietnam, we are seeing companies relocate there. So while some economies are benefiting in certain instances, in the long term, the uncertainty created by the trade war doesn't bode well for the global economy.
Negotiations between China and the US had failed to yield any results for many, many months until talks earlier this month in Washington when a deal or an agreement was reached in principle. The deal is yet to be written and it's thought to be finalised next month. Throughout the trade war, we've seen a lot of volatility. Can we be relatively sure that this deal will go through, or is it too early to say?
I think it's too early to say. We haven't, as you say, we haven't seen the deal. I think what's played out in the last week is that we've seen a truce rather than a deal. There's been a delay in tariffs that were due to come in. President Trump has tweeted about it. I don't think the Chinese have responded publicly or formally with respect to the proposed deal. So it's too early to say what the latest developments are.
And what do we know about the proposed deal so far? I know not a lot of details have been released. And what would this proposed deal mean for the trade war?
So President Trump announced a delay in the imposition of tariffs. The biggest concern for Australia, for the global economy, are issues around the rules-based trading system and the global trading order, i.e. the treatment of intellectual property and technology. I don't think that any of these issues, these serious structural issues, are yet being canvassed in the supposed Phase 1 deal, which is a bigger concern for the global economy.
You did mention that there has been some manufacturers move from China to Vietnam and other countries. There really has been an exodus of manufacturers from China relocating due to the high tariffs. The Chinese economy is now growing at its slowest point in 30 years, and while this slowdown is only in part due to the trade war, has it got to a point where China was backed against a wall, so to say, and had no choice but to try and find a truce or an end to this trade war?
We are still yet to see a final deal, so time will tell. In some ways, China's slowing growth is a factor of it becoming a bigger economy. So if it's growing 6 or 7% every year, as it grows larger, it's harder to maintain that growth. And every mature economy has a slower, lower growth rate than China's currently has been for a very long time. So that is natural, but obviously the trade war and the uncertainty around that is impacting the Chinese economy as it is impacting the global economy.
The US President Donald Trump had said that the US is winning the trade war, but at what cost has this come to the US?
Well, right now, unemployment in America is at record lows. So by many indicators, the American economy is doing very well. There are certain states, particularly agricultural producers, who depend on large exports to China, who are finding the current conditions challenging. They are also key Trump states. We look forward to the 2020 election. I think President Trump will want to have a deal be able to be at least announced before going into the next election. But there are some parts of the American economy that are hurting as a result of these trade tensions, but by and large, the American economy is going strong.
Hugo Seymour, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
A real pleasure. Thank you, Sam.